"Where do flowers get their colors?" asked a visitor of Mr. Burbank one day. "From the bees and the butterflies and the birds," was the reply, "and from us." Let us pick up a geranium, such as might be found in any dooryard in America, and see what Mr. Burbank meant. If we were to strip off its 5 brilliant petals soon after they have opened and slice the base of the blossom in half, we should find ourselves looking into a tiny nest of geranium eggs, round, white, moist, mushy eggs with a soft, skinny covering for shells. Carefully packed in a pulpy formation, these eggs, we should observe, are encased in a well-protected nest, longer than its breadth, oval, except that its top extends upward in the form of a single tiny stalk. Surrounding this neatly packed nest of geranium eggs with its single upright stalk and hugging it closely all around, we should see 10 modified leaves, a quarter of an inch or so in length, ending each in a pointed stalk as big around, perhaps, as a bristle out of a hairbrush. 10 such leaves in 2 rows, as if shielding the egg chamber and its central stalk from harmful intruders. At the top of the 10 surrounding stalks, we should see the crosswise bundles nicely balanced, of beautiful golden orange pollen dust, loosely held in half-burst packages. And at their base, we should find the syrup factory of the geranium, a group of tiny glands which manufacture a sticky confection that covers the bottom of the flower with its sweetness. Shall we take one of the egg-like seeds from its nest and plant it? We might as well plant a toothpick. Shall we take a package of the pollen and put it in the ground? We might as well sow a thimble of flour. But let us combine one of those eggs with a grain of that pollen, and 3 days in the soil will show us that we have produced a living, growing thing. A new geranium plant with an individuality, a personality of its own, an infant geranium, which we for the first time have brought into being. A thing which has never lived before, yet which has within it all of the tendencies inherited from ages of ancestry. Tendencies good and tendencies bad. Tendencies good and tendencies bad, which wait only on environment to determine which will tendencies good and tendencies bad, which wait only on environment to determine which shall predominate. By the simple combination of the pollen and the egg, we have produced an entirely new plant, which may, if we will it, become the founder of a whole race of new and better geraniums. How shall we go about it to make a combination such as this between the pollen dust and the seed-like egg so snugly stowed away within its nest? Let us examine that central stalk inside the double guard of pollen-bearing stamens, and we shall have the answer. As the stamens fall away, we begin to see a transformation in the stalk. Its upper end, which at first seemed single, now shows a tendency to divide into 5 curling tendrils, moist and sticky. Though we may plant pollen in the ground without result, we have but to place it on one of these sticky tendrils as they curl from the end of that central pistil stalk. To start an immediate and rapid growth. Once planted there, the pollen grain begins to throw out a downward shoot into and through the pistil stalk, forming itself into a tube which, extending, finally taps the egg chamber and makes possible a union between the nucleus of that pollen grain and the egg below which awaits its coming. So to produce a new geranium, we have but to dust the grains of pollen upon the sticky stigma of that central pistil stalk, and when the flower has withered away, its duty done, we shall find within the egg chamber a package of fertile geranium seed ready for planting. But there arises now a difficulty. While those little packages of pollen dust are there, the central pistil stalk inside keeps shut up tight, and it has no sticky surface on which to dust the pollen. And if we search for another blossom which shows an open sticky pistil, we shall find that the pollen packages which once surrounded it have gone. To make our combination between the pollen grains and the egg-like seeds, therefore, we find it necessary to search first for one blossom which is in its pollen-bearing stage, and then for another blossom which has passed this point and shows a receptive, sticky stigma. We are forced to make the combination between the two instead of between the pollen grains and the eggs of a single blossom, which is exactly what the mother geranium intended we should do. If the stigma of a blossom were at its receptive stage when the pollen packages around it burst open, there would probably be combined in the seeds of its egg chamber below only the characteristics of one parent plant, only the tendencies of a single line of ancestry. The geraniums growing from those seeds would be so like in their tendencies of heredity that they would differ individually only as their individual environments differed. But when those eggs have brought to them the pollen from another plant, there are confined within them the tendencies and characteristics of two complex lines of ancestry. So that the plants into which they grow will be encouraged into variation and individuality, not as a result of environment alone, but as a result of the countless tendencies inherited from two separate lines of parentage. What a scheme for pitting the old tendencies of heredity against the new tendencies of environment. What an infinite possibility of combinations this opens up. Truly, of 1,000,000 geranium blossoms, no two could be exactly alike, nor any two of their 5,000,000 petals, nor any two of their 10,000,000 stamens, nor any two of their 100,000,000 honey glands, nor any two of their 1,000,000,000 pollen granules. What we have seen in the geranium, those seed-like eggs, the sticky stigma, and that microscopic pollen dust, we may see in some form or other in every plant that grows. The act which we might have performed to produce a new geranium plant, the combination of one of those seeds with some of that pollen, is going on about us always, everywhere, with the bees and the butterflies and the birds and the winds and a score of other agencies acting to effect those combinations, which is the reason for the candy factory at the bottom of every geranium's little central well, and for those brilliant petals and that delicate scent and the picket arrangement of the stamen stalk, and the crosswise poise of their pollen-bearing anthers, and the central pistil stalk which rises upward from the egg nest, and everything that is beautiful and lovely in the bloom of that geranium, and the geranium itself. Here is a plant, the geranium, so anxious to produce variations in its offspring that it has lost the power of fertilizing its own eggs and risked its whole posterity upon the cooperation of a neighboring plant. It has no power of locomotion, no ability to get about from place to place in search of pollen for its eggs or of eggs in need of its pollen, nor has its neighbor, so they call in an outside messenger of reproduction, the bee. The geranium makes its honey at the bottom of its blossom. It places movable packages of pollen dust balanced on springy stamens in such a way that, to ready the sweets, the pollen hedge must be broken through. It keeps its egg chamber closed and its pistil unreceptive while the pollen dust is there, and as if to advertise its hidden sweets to the nectar-loving bees, it throws out shapely petals of brilliant hue and exudes a charming scent. And thus the bees, attracted from afar, crowding into the tiny wells to get their sweets, becomes besmeared with pollen dust as they enter a pollen-bearing bloom and leave a load of pollen dust wherever they find a receptive stigma. The bees gather pollen not only for distribution, but for their own uses. The two large splotches of pollen shown beneath the second pair of legs are pollen dough, which the bee... This direct color photograph print shows a bee, greatly enlarged, which was captured in a cactus flower. The pollen grains can be seen sticking to its hairy body, and the fact that, as it crawls into the next flower, some of this pollen will find lodgment on the sticky surface of a receptive stigma is easily realized. The bees gather pollen not only for distribution but for their own uses. The two large splotches of pollen shown beneath the second pair of legs are pollen dough, which the bees carry home for food. Where did the geranium get its color? From the bees, said Mr. Burbank. Just as the cactus covered itself with spines until it had built up an effective armor, in the same way the geranium by easy stages has worked out a color scheme to attract the bees upon which it depends to effect its reproduction. In Mr. Burbank's yard there grows, as this is written, a Chinese arum whose color and whose scent reveals a different history. Unlike most common flowers which advertise to bees and birds and butterflies, this plant sends its message to the flies. Flies feed on carrion. The nectar of clover is not to their liking, and the brilliant colors of our garden flowers fail to attract them. Our refuse is their food, and they are guided to it by colors and scents which are offensive to us. So this Chinese carrion lily, as it has been named, stranded at some time in its history, perhaps in some place where flies were its only available messengers of reproduction, or blooming at a period when other means were not within its reach, has bedecked its space with a rich and mottled purple in color and in texture, resembling from a distance the color and texture of a decaying piece of liver. The smell emitted from this flower is offensive in the extreme. All an advertisement to the flies, which are carrion-loving insects. Just as the geranium supplements its advertisement in color with an advertisement in scent, so too the carrion lily has developed an individual odor appeal, decidedly like that of meat too long exposed to the sun, so obnoxious and so penetrating is the odor of this flower that each year it has been found necessary to cut down the plant shortly after it has bloomed. And so truly it has achieved its ideal that even the buzzards, carrion birds that they are, attracted by its color, its texture, and its smell, have descended in ever-narrowing circles only to fly away in disgust when they found they had been lured by a flower. And so truly has it achieved its ideal that even the buzzards, carrion birds that they are, attracted by its color, its texture, and its smell, have descended in ever-narrowing circles only to fly away in disgust when they found they had been lured by a flower. Where the geranium finds it satisfactory merely to block the entrance to its honey store with an array of pollen bundles, which must be pushed aside by the entering insect, the Chinese carrion lily makes doubly sure of pollination by means of a still more ingenious device. The fly, attracted by the color of the spathe and guided by the hidden color at the base of the flower, lights on the sturdy spadix and uses it as a ladder for descent. The opening around the spadix is just large enough to afford a comfortable passageway, but once within the well, the spathe closes in and snugly hugs the spadix, so that the fly, buzzing about in the chamber below, becomes thoroughly covered with the pollen dust. This done, the flower slowly unfolds and permits the pollen-laden insect to escape. Many other flowers show equal or greater ingenuity. In some varieties of the sage, the pollen-bearing stamens actually descend and quickly rub the yellow dust on either side of the insect, after which they fall back into their former position above the nectar cells. Most of the orchids, too, show an unusual ingenuity. One species bears its pollen in small bundles, the base of each bundle being a sticky disc. The structural arrangement of the flower is such that the insect cannot secure its nectar without carrying away at least one of the bundles. A pollen bundle glues itself to the head of the insect and curves upward like a horn. As soon as the insect has withdrawn from the flower, this pollen horn bends downward in front of the insect, close to its head, so that when the next flower is entered, the dust can hardly fail to reach a receptive portion of the pistil. In this orchid, there is but a single receptive stigma, and the pollen bundles are separate and single too. But in another orchid which has two receptive stigmas, the pollen bundles are in doublets, held together with a strap. Thus the insect visiting this second orchid carries away two pollen bundles on its forehead, each so nicely placed that their dust will reach both sticky stigmas of the next flower entered. Flowers are usually not only designed by their general shape to attract insects, but their nectar store is often surrounded by a target of some kind, sometimes of color only, and sometimes, as in the case of the orchid, a folded leaf which guides the insect in. Almost all flowers in this way have centers which are white or more brilliant than or different from the rest of their color, as if to lead the insect to its work with the least possible delay. The orchid's pollen may be seen in this photograph print directly in the center of the flower. With the rest of the blossom torn away, the orchid's pollen bundles and its sticky stigma may be seen in this photograph print. These bundles attach themselves to the head of the insect, sticking out like a horn so that the next flower visited will be sure to receive its charge of pollen. The sticky stigma can be seen in this print directly beneath the two pollen bundles at the top. The petal itself, of course, is bent down to show the structure, but it can be seen that the colors and all of the lines lead to the central point as if to guide the bee. Similarly, the pollen of the milkweed is stored in two little bags connected by a strap. When the bee visits the flower, its feet become entangled in this strap, and when it leaves, it carries both bags with it. And so, throughout the whole range of plant life, each fresh investigation would show a new display of ingenuity, infinite ingenuity, directed toward the single end of combining the tendencies of two lines of heredity, so that the offspring may be different from and better than the parent. We should see that there are those flowers which bloom We should see that there are those flowers which bloom only in the night, flowers which, as if having tried to perfect a lure for the insects of the day and having failed, have reversed the order of things and send forth blossoms of white or yellow, luminous colors away to attract the moths that fly after the sun goes down. We should find many interesting half hours of wonder, contemplating such flowers as the honeysuckle, the nasturtium, and many of the lilies, which have taken special precaution to place their nectar in long, horn-like tubes out of the reach of insects, so that only the birds may become their messengers of reproduction. The common nasturtium may be taken as a type of flower which advertises to the birds rather than to the bees. The honey is stored at the bottom of a long tube down which a bee could hardly stretch its proboscis. In many other ways, including the arrangement of the stamens and pistils, bird flowers show their adaptation in the partnership which their ancestors have built up. In many other ways, including the arrangement of the stamens and pistils, bird flowers show their adaptation to the partnership which their ancestors have built up. In many other ways, including the arrangement of the stamens and pistils, bird flowers show their adaptation to the partnership which their ancestors have built up. We should see the pathos of those flowers which advertise for insects that rarely come. The barberry, for example, which can be pollinated only during the bright hours of a cloudless day and during a time so short that there is little chance of pollen being brought by insects from other blossoms, each barberry blossom ready for the insect if it should come, but as if expecting disappointment. Make sure of self-perpetuation, if not of self-improvement, by jabbing its pollen-laden anthers on its own stigma with a motion as positive and as accurate as the jump of a cat. Or the fennel flower of France, in which the several pistils bend over and take pollen from the stamens around them and straighten up again. Or the flowers of the nettle, in which the stamens increase their height with a sudden spring-like action, showering the pollen up over the receptive stigma. We should observe that wheat and some of the other grains as though discouraged by centuries and centuries of failure to secure variation, had settled down to the steady task of reproducing their kind exactly as it is. Exactly as it is. We should observe that wheat and some of the other grains, as though discouraged by centuries and centuries of failure to secure variation, had settled down to the steady task of reproducing their kind exactly as it is, depending only on individual environment for individuality and ensuring reproduction by self-pollination. We should see plants in all stages of their attempts to keep their kind on the upward trend, We should see a range of ingenuity so great that no man, no matter how many of his days have been devoted to the study of plants and their ways, can ever become dulled to its wonders. I bought some extremely expensive seed corn several years back, complained a Santa Rosa farmer, but just as I expected, it ran down. The first year's corn was fine, and so was the second, but now it has gone clear back to ordinary corn. This plant improvement doesn't pay. Do you know how corn reproduces itself? Asked Mr. Burbank. Do you realize that if you plant good corn on one side of a fence and inferior corn on the other, the corn cannot see the fence? Would you expect that a cross between a race horse and some family Dobbin would produce a line of racers? Separate your good corn from your poor, and keep it by itself, and you will find that it does not run down, but even gradually improves. Separate your good corn from your poor, and keep it by itself, and you will find that it does not run down, but it even gradually improves. Separate your good corn from your poor, and keep it by itself, and you will find that it does not run down, but even gradually improves. Separate your good corn from your poor, and keep it by itself, and you will find that it does not run down, but even gradually improves. Every farmer knows that corn must be planted in large quantities close together, that a single kernel of corn planted in one corner of a lot apart from other growing corn would be non-productive. Yet how many of those who depend upon corn for their living fully realize the reason for this? The geranium, with its nectar, its scent, its color, and its structural arrangement, has built up a partnership with the bee to perform its pollination, while corn with no advertisement, no honey, no brilliant reds, no scent, has developed an equally effective plan of making the breezes act as its messenger of reproduction. Here is a plant, tall and supple, that responds with graceful movements to the slightest breath of air. At its top it holds a bunch of pollen-laden tassels, swaying tassels, which, with each backward and forward movement, discharge their tiny pollen grains in clouds, which slowly settle to the ground. Below, on the stalk of the plant, are the ears of corn containing row after row of the egg kernels, needing but combination with pollen from above to become each a seed capable of starting another corn plant on its life. The ear of corn shown at the left is one which, on an ordinary corn plant, was allowed to take its course. The other ear is one which was covered with a paper bay at the time when the pollen was flying. The strands of silk thus being protected from pollen, the kernels beneath did not mature. It will be seen from this that the breezes are as necessary to the corn plant as the bees and the birds are to the flowers. Just as the eggs of the geranium were housed in a productive covering, so too the corn eggs are sheathed in protective husks. And just as a tiny stalk protruded from the egg chamber of the geranium, so too does the silk which protrudes from the end of the husk serve the same purpose for the corn seed. Tear the husks from an ear of corn, and it will be seen that each strand of the protruding silk goes back to an individual kernel on the ear. That's between the rows of kernels, like electric wires in a conduit. Each strand of the common bundle of silk protruding leads back to its separate starting place. To combine the characters of two parent corn plants, all that is necessary is to dust the pollen from the tassel of one on the silken ducts of the ear of another. Is to dust the pollen from the tassel off one on the silken ducts of the ear of another. And the breezes, as they swish a waving field of corn gracefully to and fro, as they play through a forest of pines, as they ripple the grasses of our lawns, are performing their function in the scheme of reproduction as effectively as the bee does when it goes from geranium to geranium in search of sweets. Consider the simple saltwater cell as seen reproducing itself under the microscope merely by splitting in two, and those two each becoming two, and so on endlessly. Observe that, with only a single line of parentage from which to draw tendencies, the individualities to be found in this, the lowest form of life we know, are molded wholly by the difference in the saltiness of the water, or the variation in its temperature, or those other limited changes within a short-lived environment. And then consider the geranium and the Chinese arum and the orchid and the corn with 1,000 added complications in their lives brought about by a single dominant purpose. 1,000 self-imposed difficulties and obstacles which would be needless except for that guiding desire to give the offspring a better chance than the parent had. What a price to pay for variation. What ingenuity and effort each new combination of heredities has cost. How many must have been the plants which advertised for insects that did not come? How many, finding themselves in an unequal struggle, have perished in the attempt? Truly, if the cost of things may be taken as a measure of their value, how much must this dearly bought variation be worth in the scheme of things?